Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books I'm doing the Classics and Contemporary Pairs tag. This was created by Jen at Insert Literary Pun here, and I was tagged by Claire at Claire Reads Books, so I will link both of their excellent videos down below. This tag consists of pairing up an older book with a more modern book, and they should be books that have some kind of shared similarity. So whether that's through the plot, or the characters, or themes, or writing style, there should be certain connections between the two books that would make it worth your while to read them in conjunction. So as you can see from the big stack of books behind me, my mind went in a lot of different directions for this tag. So I have a lot of books to talk about, so I'm just going to get right to it. The first classic I'm going to talk about is the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is kind of an infamous short story about a man who wakes up one day and he has been transformed into some kind of very unfortunate creature, often interpreted as some kind of insect. So it is a story that is really absurdly comic, but also deeply tragic at the same time. Like, you really do feel for this man. And there are two more contemporary updates that have kind of twisted this story in interesting ways. The first one is a short story by Haruki Murakami called Samsa in Love, where he takes a story and does the complete opposite, where there is a bug that has been transformed overnight into a man. It was interesting to experience the human body as something really unnatural and grotesque, so that was kind of a cute retelling of this story. As well, there's also the novel Blackass by Igomi Barrett. He is a Nigerian author, and this is a book where a black Nigerian man wakes up one morning as a white man, although he still has a black ass, which is where the title comes from. So the story was pretty ridiculous satire, and it kind of plays with the way that he is treated differently when he is someone of a different race. The book is a very irreverent take on white privilege, and though this book didn't quite live up to its fabulous premise, I still think it's worth checking out to see this thought experiment in action and to learn a bit more about life in present-day Nigeria, because you do learn a little bit about the difficulties that are going on, especially in regards to the job crisis for young people. So that was quite a different retelling of the old Kafka story. One of my favorite modern classics is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It depicts multiple generations of the cursed Buendia family, but also explores Colombia's history throughout the years as a country. So while you're going through all the dramatic happenings of this one family, you're also exploring the different civil wars that have happened in Colombia, how they've faced modernization and colonization. So it's one of those books that satisfies you on a plot level, but also can teach you a little bit about a different part of the world. So any book that resembles this one is bound to make me happy, and I have two books to talk about. The first one is Beauty is a Wound by Kurniawan. He's an Indonesian author, and this book also explores multiple generations, and the family is driven by a curse, which is a nice dark twist to this story. It also teaches you about Indonesian history. So you get to see how Indonesia has dealt with Dutch colonization and how they fought with Japan during World War II and how communism affected the country as well. So there is a lot of bloody history going on, as well as a juicy family saga to drive the plot forward. And this book does hit on a lot of similar magical realism notes that you could see in 100 Years of Solitude, especially with an iconic opening where a prostitute rises from the grave. So this is an excellent read. Another book in a similar vein is Chintu by Jennifer Nansubuga Mukumbi. This is a book that again is going through multiple generations of a cursed family, but will also teach you a lot about Uganda in the past and in the present. This book begins in the 1750s and continues into the present day. And what makes this book different than the others, it is definitely more character-driven and it is more realistic. So it doesn't have the same whimsical, magical realism vibes as the other two books, and you do get to go more in depth into the lives of people in this family. So it is also good at creating an engaging plot, but connecting to current issues that Ugandans are facing today. While we're talking about magical realism, I have to mention my favorite book, which is the Russian modern classic, The Master and Margarita. This is a satire of the Soviet era, and it involves the devil coming up with some of his friends and causing a lot of havoc in Moscow. I'm going to compare The Master and Margarita with a book that I've just recently finished, The Wizard of the Crow by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He is an author that has been living out of exile from Kenya, and this book is a fierce satire on a fictional African dictatorship in the post-colonial era. So, like The Master and Margarita, there are some fierce political jabs happening here, so it's really bringing up a lot of the absurdities to bureaucracy and these power-hungry politicians. It also reminded me of The Master and Margarita because there is a lot of heart buried under that fierce satire. So it's a book that can make you laugh and roll your eyes, but it's also a book that will make you feel quite deeply. And both of these books have really solid and compelling romantic relationships at the center of their story, which is something that I very rarely find in fiction. These are two fictional couples that I'm just actively rooting for. They are kind of these broken people that find each other and make each other better and help each other achieve these lofty political goals. I love The Master and Margarita so much that I thought it would be unfair to compare any other novel to it, but Wizard and the Crow really lived up to that high standard, and they're both excellent books. One of my favorite contemporary books is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and I first read this book when I was in high school, and I was kind of too young to be intimidated by it, but I wasn't really well read at that point. So when I read it again a few years later, after I had more classics under my belt, I did gain a deeper appreciation of the text. There were two classics in particular that enriched my understanding of Infinite Jest, one of them being The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a very intense Russian classic that has a deeply dysfunctional family and an intense murder at the heart of this story. But mainly this book has three brothers, and they are all kind of archetypical characters, and they all represent different philosophies and different ways to go about living your life. And I could see these characteristics of the brothers were also represented in the three brothers of the Incandenza family in Infinite Jest. So it was kind of interesting comparing these different brothers and how they did have similar character traits. The other classic I'm going to compare to Infinite Jest is Hamlet by William Shakespeare. This was obviously an influence to David Foster Wallace since he got the title of his book from a line from Hamlet. So in Hamlet, we are seeing a royal family in a time of crisis after the king or the father of the family has died and the mother has suddenly remarried. Similar story going on in Infinite Jest, where we have the Incandenza family in a period of mourning after the father of that family has died. They're not royalty, but they are headmasters of an elite tennis boarding school, so they do have that kind of position of power. Again, the mother has quickly remarried, and it's a deeply dysfunctional family going through a difficult time. And Hal, the main character of that book, is also going through this very severe emotional, psychological breakdown. So very easy to make some comparisons with Hamlet as well. So those were two really rewarding texts to read at the same time and to compare. While we're on the topic of Hamlet, I do have to mention a modern classic that completely shifted my understanding of Hamlet, and that is Tom Stoppard's play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. So this is a play that exists within the universe of Hamlet, and it deals with two somewhat minor characters in Hamlet, and it really fleshes them out and gives them more of a backstory and just basically explores why was it necessary for these two characters to have to die in Hamlet. They're kind of tragic and innocent in this book, so it's really talking about the absurdity of life and how death is inevitable. So it's very existential, but it's also comic at the same time, and this is probably my favorite play ever. Another slightly contemporary book I'd like to talk about is A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving, and this was a book that, again, I had reread after a few years and realized that I had gained a greater understanding of this book based on the modern classics that I feel like this book is based upon. So two of those books that I think are serious influences here are Fifth Business by Robertson Davies. This is actually a little Canadian modern classic, and it's a very bizarre book, but you can see see that John Irving borrows a major element of the plot from here, where there is a freak accident involving a ball hitting someone in the head and causing some severe damage. As well, I think like the writing style was very influential for John Irving in crafting his narrator of the story. I can see he borrowed a lot of elements from the personable, chatty narrator of Fifth Business. I could also tell that John Irving was quite influenced by The Tin Drum by Günter Grass, and you can see that in the characters of Owen Meany, who is very tiny but very ferocious, who definitely reminds me of Oscar Matzerath from this book, who is like 3 feet tall, and he plays this drum, and he shrieks and breaks glass, and he's a very loud person and very small body. Although the characters are very different in disposition, and Owen is very pure and he wants to do good things with his life, whereas Oscar is very evil in a lot of ways or morally ambiguous. So they're very different people, but kind of reminiscent of each other. Another contemporary book that I thought was deeply influenced by The Tin Drum was Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, as both of these books have magical realism elements and both involve this scary witch-like figure. They also have these wild narrators that have very unconventional lives, and both books are deeply tied to the politics of their story. So The Tin Drum is exploring Germany and Poland during the Second World War, but Salman Rushdie is exploring India around the time of its independence. So both of these stories have a lot in common. The next classic on this list is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. This is a Victorian classic that is making fun of people who are social climbers. So basically people who are willing to do anything in order to gain more fame, money, and social status. So you can see this theme carried out in the more modern novels of Edith Wharton. I think that she really critiques New York society at the time and what people would do in order to continue to build status and their reputation in society. But a more contemporary book that I think takes this concept to the extreme is American Psycho by Easton Ellis, where the social climber in this book is literally a psychopathic killer. So these are fun books to compare to each other because American Psycho just takes it to such a ridiculous degree. In Thackeray and Wharton's novels, you can at least feel some degree of compassion for the characters, but you do not get that same feeling in American Psycho. Patrick Bateman is just so cold and calculated, and he is just a big parody of capitalism in the 80s. I'm not even sure that I recommend reading it. It kind of deeply traumatized me, but I do think it's kind of funny to compare to earlier social satires. The next pairing is a little out there, but hear me out on this one. I was thinking about pairing together Charlotte Bronte's Villette with Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh. So basically, these are books that have deeply troubled female protagonists at the heart of the story. These are women who are living truly lonely lives, and they're just very desperate people that have not had a happy go of things so far. And they can be kind of cold and alienating and not always the easiest people to enjoy reading from their narrative perspective. Both of them have these very overactive imaginations, and they start developing these intense fantasies in their heads about the certain men that they want to be in relationships with, but of course that's not really how things play out in their lives, and they are both truly unreliable narrators. So Eileen is definitely a lot more crass than Lucy Snow, but I think it's more the contemporary voice kicking in. So if Lucy Snow was not written in the Victorian era, I think we would be hearing a lot more of her dark and disturbing thoughts as well. My next comparison is the His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman with Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is a long and intense English poem that has to do with Satan's involvement in the fall of Adam and Eve. And I just have to say that it is so cool that Philip Pullman is writing children's literature that is so dense in allusions to such a heavily philosophic work. So when I was a kid reading His Dark Materials, I obviously wasn't picking up on those themes, but since I have reread them now, having read Paradise Lost, really enhanced my appreciation of those books, since they are grappling with such big ideas about kind of the nature of good and evil, and definitely stuff about the afterlife and heaven and hell. So Philip Pullman is playing with a lot of big ideas that you can also see John Milton exploring in this poem. So two very different works, but exploring some of the same ideas. My last comparison is kind of a joke, but I had to go there. I'm going to compare Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This is a classic that is pretty much as depressing as it gets. This is about a deeply tragic man who is failed by every institution in his life, and it features a really dark, sad ending. So I thought I had to compare this book with A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, mainly because this is also a deeply depressing book with a central character named Jude. So if you are a person who enjoys reading about really terrible things happening to people named Jude, then you should definitely check out both of these books. A Little Life definitely had a polarizing reception upon its release, as a lot of people thought that Hanya Yanagihara went way too intense with the torture she lays out in this book. But even as intense as the reactions are to this book, at least it has never been burnt in public by a bishop like Jude the Obscure was. So they are both two really intense books that will make you feel terrible about your life. So that's it for my list. We have made it through this long stack of books. Please let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with some of my pairings or have some of your own. As for tagging people, I was trying to think of people who talk about an interesting mix of classics and contemporary. So I would like to tag Lydia over at LK Holmes. Her channel is just wonderful, and she's always reading a really compelling, interesting stack of books. I'd like to tag the medieval reader, since she is always reading a unique assortment of classics that you don't often see popping up on BookTube. And I would also like to tag a new channel that I just started watching, and that is Old Blues Chapter and Verse. I think he's a newer channel, but he reads a really excellent assortment of books. So I would love to see all of those people's take on this tag. But also, if I didn't tag you, please do this tag anyway, because it is such a cool idea and I've loved watching people's videos so far. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.